I am your warrior. I am your justice. I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob.
They are God-denying demons that butcher babies and hate this nation.
They support grooming children.
I'm just an average American. What's going to become of us real Americans?
They're coming after you next. Period. Full stop.
So we are talking with Professor Christopher Zurn. He's professor of social and political philosophy at University of Massachusetts at Boston and the author of this recent book, Splitsville USA, A Democratic Argument for Breaking Up the U.S. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Zurn.
Thanks for having me, Professor Brown.
Yes, we're both academics, although my academic field is a little bit removed from political philosophy, but I try and do the best I can. So,
well, and I tried to write this book not for political philosophers, but for my fellow citizens. So,
well, that was one thing I wanted to say from the beginning is this is an academic book. I mean, Routledge is an academic publisher, but anybody who thinks they should be intimidated or something because of that, I don't think that's really necessary. I found it pretty easy to read and accessible. So, because I know academics can get really into the weeds and theory, and you can sometimes be very difficult to sort through things. But this is definitely written for a general audience, and you definitely want people to be able to read it.
Yep. Thank you.
You're also the author of Deliberative Democracy and the Institutions of Judicial Review and Axel Honneth, A Critical Theory of the Social. So your background is in political philosophy. What are those two? So what kind of particular specialty in political philosophy?
I think one of my strong interests is in constitutional democracy and how it works and how it works around the world in different places and how it goes wrong and when it goes wrong. And I didn't really think for a long time that I was thinking as much about my home country, but things seemed to start going wrong, say 15 years ago, and we've really been on a democratic decline. We're losing our Republican government, I think, and that really started to worry me. And so instead of trying to do fancy academic theories, I really started to think about what kinds of solutions there might be. And I think a negotiated dissolution of the United States is the solution I came up with. As radical and wacky as that is, I think that might be our only hope for saving Republican democracy going forward.
Before we get started, I want to ask a couple questions. So number one, it's been about 6 or 9 months since the book was published. Is that?
Yeah. We're getting close to 10 or 11 or something like that.
Oh, okay, 10 or 11.
Yeah.
So first, what has the reception been both from fellow academics, specialists, and just other people that work in that kind of area, and then also from, for lack of a better word, a lay audience, like someone like me? Has it been different or positive, negative?
It's certainly not what I expected. It hasn't gotten a lot of academic reception. There's a lot of books published all the time, and it takes a long time for academics to get book reviews out and that kind of thing. I did try and get some reviews in some ordinary press, and one reaction was sort of indicative. I had an editor at a small paper who said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to have your book reviewed." And the editor sent it to one of their typical reviewers, and the reviewer said, "No, this is a disgusting book. I can't stand it. I can't review it." So that was the end of that. I think the immediate reaction is somewhat, people are more shocked than I think they ought to be about the idea of a peaceful dissolution of the United States. So I found a fair amount of immediate negative reaction. And then I've had people come back to me 9-10 months later after reading it who didn't want to comment at all about it and want now to talk to me about it. So it's interesting. I mean, I think it's a more plausible idea than people immediately give it credit for. People want to dismiss it right away. But given a little bit of time and a little bit of thought and a little bit of looking around our political world makes it seem like maybe we need to do something.
Yeah, I think the evidence for that we just keep getting more and more of it. Like every week, every month that goes by, there's something new. And then why do you think this is still, given that there is kind of increasing interest, do you think this is still such a taboo topic? I have my own ideas about that, but I'm interested what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think, because you've been in the trenches of these kinds of ideas for longer than I have. I don't have a really good theory of that. Part of it is just the psychology of a very strong attachment to a notion of national identity that's very crucial in the United States. And that's a different identity than other sort of, for instance, sort of ethno-nationalist identities that you see around other nation states. So there's a very strong identity to the idea of the United States, the idea of America as something unique, city on a hill, that kind of thing. People have a very strong reaction to that. So I think that's part of it. I think another probably less obvious reason is that a lot of our discourse about politics is quite nationalized. And if you have national political elites, of course, they don't have an interest in this idea because they have power at the height of a very powerful nation state of 330 or 340 million people. And they have no interest in being in power in a 70 million or 100 million or 150 million person nation state. So, I mean, since a lot of our political discourse operates only at the national level, right? What you see on MSNBC or Fox News or CNN or ABC or, the mainstream press or the Twitterverse for that matter is really focused on national politics. And it's not those folks. Those folks aren't going to do well with this kind of an idea.
They're not, yeah. No, I think those are both accurate reasons, especially the first one. I don't know what it is about the United States that we seem to hold everything, like the Constitution and different institutions. We almost have this quasi-religious idea about things that, like, I eventually just came to the fact that, these are just ways we have of organizing how we do things and how we come to decisions and get things done. And you just choose, whatever you think works best and don't get such an emotional attachment to it. But it's definitely been drilled into the culture from an early age.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. But one thing I've noticed, though, about California, I think that's very much less so in California. There's not really that kind of, the flag and, flags everywhere and rah, rah.
So there's more openness to a kind of institutional change.
There's more openness to institutional change because there's just less of a emotional attachment to that we're number one, America at all costs kind of thing. It's just not, it's not as strong here. I'm not saying it's not here, but it's not as strong as other places, I think.
Interesting. Yeah.
So you give a very short description of what is politics and what's the purpose of politics. This was based on, what's his name?
Jeremy Waldron.
Yes, Jeremy Waldron. So could you just quickly give that, because I think that sets the frame well. When you did that in the book, that really helped to get my mind in the right place.
Yeah, so, I mean, Waldron basically says politics is about a particular kind of situation. So here's the situation. We live together with other people. We need common rules. We need to settle on common rules, but we disagree about what the content of those rules should be. And we can solve that disagreement through violence. That's not politics. Or we can solve it nonviolently, and that's politics. It's when we need to have shared rules and we disagree about the content. And that disagreement is sort of just part of what it is to be humans because of our different perspectives, because of our different backgrounds, because of our different values, and so on and so on. We're going to inevitably disagree about what those rules should be, but we also need to settle on them or else we can't, get along. So politics is that situation where you need to get along and you disagree about what terms to get along on. And then you can solve politics in a couple of really simple ways, just really boldly. I mean, you can have one person say what the rules are going to be, We call that a dictatorship or a tyranny or a king or what, a monarchy, or, it's got lots of different names.
Or being a parent sometimes.
What's that?
Or being a parent occasionally.
Yeah, being a parent. Well, I mean, being a parent is a sort of, autocracy, right? It is it's sort of like a do-ocracy usually, if you have two parents or something like that. But you could do it democratically, where everybody has an equal say in the content of those rules. And, those are basically the choices. If we want to do politics, if we want to non-violently negotiate what our rules are going to be, we can give one person or one small group of people, an oligarchy or plutocracy or something like that, the endless say, or we can do something democratic or Republican, which is we represent the equal political power of each person. So that's the idea of that. Waldron has the idea of what politics is. And then if we want to do that democratically, we need to be kind of committed to the outcomes of democratic elections. And I guess that's the next piece of my thesis.
Yeah. That we don't have that democratic pre-commitment, right? So,
yeah, basically I agree that when I'm the loser, I will, try and win next time, but acknowledge that the representatives who did won, and they get to say for a while what the rules are until, the next election. So we've got to be committed to the outcomes of elections, whether we like the outcomes or not. And that's a kind of fragile achievement. That's a fragile modern achievement. And that's what, at least I think symptomatically, is really threatened in the United States.
So I want to come back to the idea of a democratic pre-commitment. Before we get to, it's that it leads right into it. But before we do that, maybe take a few minutes just to give the overall, your overall thesis argument. In the book, you lay it out in like 10 or 12 points, but just what's the main outline? It's funny because when I was reading it, I was like, it's almost, I feel like mathematicians and philosophers kind of think similar alike, like I lay out this follows from this.
Right. I mean, I did my little philosopher job of having the points arguments and, however many premises and a conclusion.
Right.
The basic idea is this. You got to have people buying into free and fair and regular elections and obeying the outcomes of them. That's the only way you can sustain a democracy over time. That's not the most important thing about a democracy. It's not the essence of a democracy. It's just, you got to have it. In the same way, you got to have oxygen to have plants grow, or you got to have oxygen to make an internal combustion engine fire. It doesn't work if you don't have that thing. So you got to have people buying into that. The basic thesis of the diagnosis I have, and I don't think I'm not alone in this diagnosis. There's a lot of people who share something like this. Our institutions are incentivizing politicians to undermine democracy. That is to say, we get the politicians we have because our institutions are giving incentives to our representatives to undermine democracy. Why? Because there's lots of ways at the national level of getting and maintaining power without majority support. In other words, with minoritarian support. If you have institutions that incentivize politicians to get and maintain power without majority support, they also have a very strong incentive, a very straightforward incentive to undermine democracy itself, to call into question the democratic processes, to call into question elections, to call into question constitutional norms, to call into question the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So our institutions are actually giving us the kinds of politicians who are undermining the very basis of those institutions. So that's the diagnosis. Our institutions are problematic. And it's not an accident they're problematic. We did them 235 years ago as the sort of first shot at constitutional democracy in the world. It's a kind of fine-tuning kind of thing to get this stuff right. And we didn't get it all right, but we're stuck with that machinery. That's the really deep problem. We're really, really stuck with that machinery. And that machinery is now grinding us away from democracy and towards something like electoral authoritarianism. My thesis is the way to get out of that is to have a negotiated dissolution, to feed on the energy that's driving us down. That is the extreme polarization, the hatred, all the stuff that people usually talk about, to feed on that energy, to split us up into several new nation states, which could reboot really good institutions of Republican democracy.
Okay, that's a very good summary. Appreciate that. Okay, so I really want to drill down in this idea of the democratic pre-commitment, because it was clear reading the opening of your book that this was really the impetus, kind of why you started writing this in the first place, or why you started thinking about it, was that you were really alarmed by this. So you give a couple different definitions of it. In one place, you say it's a refusal to accept the outcome of elections, even if you don't like the outcome. But then most of the other places you give the definition, you have this a qualifier that people don't accept the outcome of free, fair, and regular elections, right? Yep. So it's the free, fair part, especially, that I want to kind of drill down on. The notion of what is a free and fair election, it's not like a binary, right? Like, this is 100% free and fair, and this is zero. This is North Korea, like, on the other hand, right? It's kind of a continuum, and there's different aspects to it that, it could be very good in one area, but not so great in the other. It could be degrees. So my first question is, does this concern over the lack of a democratic pre-commitment, does it depend on the perceptions or the judgments of what is free and fair, or does it only like the observable outcomes, like there's elections and just people are not accepting them, and it doesn't really matter, like, whether based empirically, whether we think they're free and fair, or whether the people are perceiving them not to be free and fair, or whether they do and they don't accept it? Does that matter, or is it just something's wrong with the elections? Like, they're not being accepted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a real divergence between, the quality of the elections and the perception of the quality of the elections. I mean, that just seems really obvious to me. In 2020, we ran pretty much the most successful election America has ever run in terms of just objective metrics of free, fair, well-run, well-counted, and all the rest of it. And almost 4 years later now, whatever it is, 3 years and 8 months, you still have a very large proportion, somewhere in the sort of 35 to 45% of the country, thinking that they were not that. So you have a very large divergence between the perception of them being free, fair, and regular, and they are regular. That's easy in the U.S. system because we don't have a parliamentary system. We just do it every 4 years for presidential elections, every 6 years for Senate, and every 2 years for House of Representatives. The perception is one thing, and the reality is a difference, and it's that chasm that gets me worried. And part of that worries me about the citizenry, but the thing that worries me more is that large numbers of political elites have bought into and continue to undermine the perception of, fraudulent elections. So they're selling the bill of goods that it's fraudulent elections. And it would be one thing for one crazy guy or three crazy people to say, the election was a fraud. Okay, you're going to get conspiracy theorists in any nation of 330 million people, but you're not going to get whole political parties sort of centering their activities around the notion that you have a fraudulent election twice, right? 2016 was also a fraud.
Yeah. So that's one thing I wanted to kind of commend you on a little bit, is that you didn't really reserve this just for the right and Republicans. That you did kind of call out Democrats a little bit. Now, I'm going to play the devil's advocate a bit, yeah. And you can respond to this. They would say that they are responding to what they perceive to be actual flaws in the system. For instance, like when Stacey Abrams questions the results, she could say, there were hundreds of, I don't know how many there were, but tens of thousands of people, or, however many thrown off the voter rolls. There's voter suppression, there's foreign interference, and, all sorts of shenanigans. And so that they would say, well, we really do believe in free and fair elections. We just think that the amount of flaws in it here is to a degree that we don't accept it as legitimate. Now, I'm not advocating whether that's true or not. I'm not saying whether I agree with that or not, but that would be, I think, their response. And then on the other hand, of course, you have the right, and they would maybe say, well, we do believe in free and fair elections, but then, as you said, they have really BS conspiracy theories and stuff. Now, I think a lot of the claims from the right, especially, are not really about claims of fraudulent, like they really don't think that the elections were on the up and up. I think a lot of that is subconsciously, or even maybe not so subconsciously, this idea of who is a real American. And when they talk about fraudulent or illegal votes, they're really not talking about, there's certain people they don't think should be part of the country. They don't think they should be voting, which I think is different. But how do you respond to that as far as, there are some legitimate flaws?
I do point out a couple of instances where Democratic Party members have, as it were, not bought into the outcome of elections. What's really notable, and this I think is really underlining my thesis, is that only one party currently has a whole set of political elites that are supporting those people who say that. So when Stacey Abrams says that, people argue about whether those particular Georgia elections were free. There's arguments there, just like folks who have arguments about the 2020 election. There are arguments there, and then we adjudicate those arguments and we see how they go. Those are people who are buying into worries about elections. You have to adjudicate the claims. What's interesting is that when Hillary Clinton said, I think in 2019 or so, that Donald Trump was an illegitimate president, nobody else in the Democratic Party took her up on that. Okay, so currently, just to use current events, Tom Cotton now is denying the outcome of the 2020 elections. Tom Cotton knows exactly what happened in the 2020 elections, but he has a very strong incentive because of the institutional structure. If he wants to get and maintain power, he has to buy in to the big lie. And he has to facially show that he buys into the big lie. That's a very different incentive structure. If, I don't know, Kamala Harris was like, yeah, Hillary Clinton's totally right. The 2016 election was a fraud and Donald Trump. But you didn't see that. And the reason you didn't see that is because in a two-party system, if you have a deficient set of institutions, only one party at a time, and it's going to change what those parties are, only one party at a time has very strong incentives to undermine democracy in order to get and maintain power without minority support, without majority support, with only minority support. So right now that happens to be the Republicans. I don't see why in 20 years, if the dynamics keep going, that it won't be on, the shoe won't be on the other foot. It could well be. Who knows? But the idea is it's the institutions. So having one or two people say things is one thing. But really, to me, what happens is, why does the whole ecosystem around that attack on democracy coalesce and reinforce it? That's the interesting question. And it seems to me it's a straightforward question of, you set up political institutions to get the kind of politicians you want. Yes. Yeah.
I think there's a real risk in this election and 2028, if we have 2028, that it's not going to be accepted very well by either side. And a lot of it depends on kind of exactly how things turn out, what the results specifically end up being. But for instance, if Donald Trump, let's say, clearly wins the Electoral College and there's no physical ballot tampering or anything, any evidence of that, I'm fairly certain that the Democratic Party would not contest that in any major way. If he wins the Electoral College and loses the popular vote, it's a little bit more iffy. And And if it's super close, there's other problems, but I think there's a lot more risk of people who are against Trump not accepting if he were to win or if he takes office. And this time it would be simply because of like myself, I don't even think he should be eligible to run. Just based on his behavior and everything he's done. I just don't think he has a commitment. He doesn't have a commitment to democracy. And, there's no reason somebody who, incited a potential overthrow of an election should be allowed to run again. That doesn't make any sense. So why should I accept this person again in office? So we're really looking at some real problems coming up in November.
I think November is going to be ugly whichever way it goes. Yeah. I guess my worry is that come 2028, 2032 and on, things will continue to get worse, in part because my diagnosis is not built around one particular politician. I think this one particular politician is successful because of our basically deficient institutions. It's sort of like, yeah, he's a successful politician, but he's also the way the institutions make it possible for him to come and maintain power is not by just one guy with his cult of personality. So I am deeply worried about November 2024. I'm also deeply worried about 2028, should we get there, 2032, and so on. I mean, I think that we can really get into a spiraling tit for tat between the two parties, where both of them are busy undermining any kind of commitment to the outcomes of elections. Yeah,
you call this the downward kind of spiral, right?
It's a kind of downward ratchet. It's really hard to get out of that downward spiral once it starts. It's the kind of tit for tat thing, especially in a bipolar or a two-party system. You can really get these sort of downward tending ratchets.
Yeah, so that's one thing people should really understand, is that yours is a structural analysis of what's going on. It's not based on personality of Donald Trump or all these things, which is something I've felt for a long time. That, in my mind, a lot of these problems come back to the Constitution itself. It's like, there's these things in the Constitution. And I do think maybe I disagree with you to an extent. I think one of the underlying problems is there is kind of a right-wing reactionary movement over the past 40, 50 years in the US and globally. But the American institutions and the way our Constitution is set up is giving them a unique kind of path in our country that they don't necessarily have in other countries. Because of this.
I agree with that latter part. I agree that our constitutional institutions, and some that are non-constitutional institutions, some that are just, ordinary statutes could change, but won't be able to, given the structure of our politics. We can't effectively change our Constitution. I mean, that's in some sense, that is one of the deep roots of the problem. It's just a mistake, that was made at the origin to make it so difficult to change. And we're stuck with a bunch of sort of deficient institutions, which we've been lucky to avoid their problems, but of late have become really, really evident. The most important of which is to change the Constitution takes an enormous amount of agreement across an enormous number of sectors. Said another way, small ball minority veto players can pretty much sink the whole thing. At one point, I calculate that you would be able to defeat any constitutional amendment through representatives who represent around 1/22nd of the entire U.S. population. That is to say, if 21 to 22, right, it was just 1 out of 22 people said no, that's it for a constitutional amendment. That's a very strong minority veto power. 4.4% of the U.S. population, representatives representing 4.41% of the U.S. population could veto any constitutional amendment. There's strong incentives for them to keep those minority powers alive. So the fact that our Constitution is so difficult to change and that it has a number of other minority vetoes.
So why don't you go through, you list about six of these. So why don't you take a minute to list, that was the last one. You had like 5 other ones. So
Yeah. So, the first and most obvious that everyone's pretty aware of is the disproportionality of the Senate. So the U.S. Senate, every state gets 2 senators. Californians are deeply aware of this.
Very aware.
It's extraordinarily disproportionate. Of course, adding in the modern filibuster rule of 60 means that 40 senators get a veto, which is, I forget my numbers, something like 25% of the country gets a veto on any statute.
I think it's less than that. I think it's more like 11.
It is less. I'm sorry.
I think it's 11 or 12.
You're the mathematician. I'm trying to remember my numbers. I'm just a poor philosopher. Another weird thing. So the Senate disproportionality, by the way, is the only thing in the U.S. Constitution left that cannot be changed by constitutional amendment, as well as the 20-year safe harbor for the international slave trade. But that went by after 20 years. The second thing, so Senate disproportionality is one. The fact that partisans make districts in a geographical first past the post system is just Looney Tunes. It's just, that's not something constitutional. We could change that by statute, but good luck with that, because of course the people who got there by having their politicians draw their districts. So they're not about to change that. I mean, that is Looney Tunes, to have politicians changing their vote, choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians is just kind of crazy. So that's partisan districting. Another one, of course, that we came up against in 2020 is that state legislatures, at least in theory, control the Electoral College, which is a very strange thing, right? So you have the U.S. president is actually chosen at the behest of state legislatures. Now, that doesn't come into play much, but it was attempted to be used in the sort of John Eastman coup plot. Okay. Another one, of course, that we're really familiar with, and Californians in particular are familiar with, is the disproportionality of the Electoral College. And that's sort of downstream of the senatorial thing, because every state gets 2 electors automatically from their Senate representation, plus at least 1. So there's a lot of disproportionality in the Electoral College. And trying to get my facts right here, Darren, I don't want to misstate it, but I think it's something like 5 elections out of the 45 or so presidential elections have been where the vote loser won the Electoral College. 2 of those have happened in the last 24 years. Right, 2000 and 2020, and that's very weird.
Yeah,
right?
And by the way, I think the 2020 election, even though Gore came out and I accept.
I meant 2016, 2000 and 2016. Sorry,
2000. Yeah, so the 2000 election, where Al Gore came out and I disagree, but I accept the Supreme Court. So we had a peaceful transfer of power, and that was, but. I remember it pretty well. That got under the skin of a lot of people, and it was something that kind of they put away and kind of compartmentalized, I think. But then I think when we start getting into the more recent stuff in the years, I think that's still lurking in the background. It's like this. That's when I think a lot of this stuff started. Was that 2020 election really rubbed people the wrong way?
The 2000 election, yeah.
I keep saying 2020, 2000 election, yeah.
Yeah. It was a very interesting time and a very strange Supreme Court decision, which said we basically decided this just for today,
right? And
it has no precedential value. No, yeah. Anyhow, I'm not going to relitigate 2000.
No, so go continue.
Another very weird thing about our Constitution is that we have lifetime appointments for the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, which is incredibly powerful. Nowhere else do you have lifetime appointments to a politically unaccountable body. In other words, we have sort of, politicians in robes who don't stand for election. They're not recallable by elections. We can't throw the bums out. And we can't get new ones after, say, 10, 15 years, which is the standard in every decent constitutional democracy, is to have limited terms for an unaccountable judiciary. You want an unaccountable judiciary for certain kinds of reasons, but you don't want to give it too much power. And we have now a purely partisan stacked judiciary. And I think that's another sort of vector of minoritarian government, because if you can get the judges that you want to get your outcomes, it's much better than going to the ballot box. Mm-hmm. You've got them there for 30 or 40 years. I mean, we've got a whole system of vetting these people so that they have no record, but everybody knows where they stand.
Yes, and when the legislative branch is so dysfunctional, the judicial branch becomes, in essence, a kind of super legislature.
So that's what I wrote my first book about.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go too deeply into that. It's a complicated question, but I do agree that right now some judges and justices are operating kind of as a super legislature, and precisely because the normal statutory process is broken, so that you only have regulatory process and judicial process for getting policy through. Right.
Are you familiar with Supreme Myths podcast, Eric Siegel?
I'm familiar with the professor, but I've never seen his podcast. No, so I'll try and check that out.
Yeah, I think he wrote a book, I think, where he says the Supreme Court is, he says it's not even a court. But he has a lot of guests, interesting guests on to talk about these kind of issues with the Supreme Court. And he has he's interviewed a lot of people that you quote in your book and that you mention, like Sandy Levinson, things like that. Okay, so we've gone over, what are the main reasons constitutionally that are driving these problems. Now, your solution is this negotiated dissolution. So how would that actually work in practice?
So really sort of briefly, I mean, the idea is to use the institutions we have, and we're not going to get this kind of thing from at the national level. You can see there's one politician, I think, who's flirted with some notion of national divorce. That's Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's not exactly in a power position at the national level. And no one is like getting on the bandwagon of that. And there's a reason why they're not getting on the bandwagon, because the bandwagon they've got is the one that they've rode into office. So they're not very interested in undermining their own thing. But the Constitution in Article 5 does give us a way of getting constitutional change processes going through state legislatures. And I think it's going to be state legislatures who are interested in changing up the game, and potentially those particular representatives becoming, as it were, bigger fish in smaller bowls, right? That would drive a process forward, at least this is how I think about it, to get a constitutional convention going. That convention would just basically negotiate the articles of divorce, if we want to talk about it that way, or the divorce decree, as I think I call it at some point. And that's just basically, where are the lines, who gets which resources, how do we move the military around, what do we do with nukes, who gets diplomatic stuff. And then there would have to be new constitutional processes in these new nation states. So if we got the divorce decree and it got ratified, that would be a legal way of doing it, but you might get the divorce decree and people just start divorcing whether or not there's a ratification. I'm not a prognosticator. I'm no Nostradamus. I don't know. I'm looking, it's a sort of two-step process. You get the divorce decree, and then these new nations have to do something to give themselves constitutions. They might just give themselves the U.S. Constitution again. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe they would take out all the references to slavery or something from it, or maybe they would, do some editing on it, or maybe they would just do it straight up and then just adopt the entirety of the Supreme Court corpus interpretation. Like, who knows? But at the very least, those new nations would have to give themselves their own law. They would have to go back to the preamble idea. We, the people, do hereby establish and ordain a constitution for our common life together. That's what the preamble says. They'd have to go back and do that. And I think when they do that, at least most of the new nations, if not all, would take some cognizance of the fact that we know how to do constitutional democracy better than we knew 235 years ago. they would make some changes. And I think those changes would help Republican democracy go forward. I think they would make it more sustainable. There are real, as it were, Sandy Levinson calls them constitutional stupidities. I'd rather say constitutional infelicities. But there are real problems with our Constitution. We could fix some of that stuff, but we can't fix it given the Article 5 Amendment power without doing something like having constitutional reboots. So that's I hope that gives at least a story about how that would go.
No, I get you. So this is Article 5, which is where the actual state legislatures have the power to do this. They don't have to rely on federal people who don't have the incentive. And I think that's the point you're making.
Exactly right.
You're relying on the people who actually have the political incentive to want to do something along these lines. And you also mentioned that, and this gets to one of the, objections or, things that people have raised, that you think that this is also a feasible path because you're kind of building on these regional animosities and these things that are all out in the air anyway. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Let me just say a little bit about that, Darren, because it's an ugly politics that leads to dissolution. It's basically a politics of, not to put too fine a point on it, but Californians saying, you Texans are crazy. And Texans saying, you Massachusetts people are Looney Tunes. And North Dakota folks saying, you Alabama folks are just crazy. And it's not just sort of free-floating animosity, but it's about these regional issues, right? It's about guns. It's about immigration. It's about abortion. It's, these are the kinds of hot button issues that people really care about. If I talk about partisan districting and gerrymandering, I mean, people go to sleep. These structural issues, people go to sleep. But if you're talking about, the hot button issues, there's a reason they're the hot button issues, and they're regionalized. In other words, Californians just don't say, you Texans are crazy. They say something like, you're buying and selling and trading in guns that are ending up in our cities. Yeah. And Texans say, or Floridians, I should say, maybe, you Californians are, shipping abortion drugs to our state, and we don't want that, right? Massachusetts people are saying, you Texans are flying undocumented immigrants to our cities, right? And busing them to New York City, right? So there's real regional animosities around these hot button issues. They're not just national issues, but they're also regionalized issues. And I think that gives an ugly but viable politics towards that would motivate certain kinds of political entrepreneurs to move towards some kind of a national dissolution.
Yeah, I will say, just as a Californian, there's a general sense, and I get this even from people in my own family who are relatively apolitical and whatnot, that there's a real sense that a lot of people in the rest of the country, they really don't like us. I mean, it sounds kind of dramatic to say that, but
it's yeah.
I mean, if you look at the media and, the way we're depicted in the media and the way we're talked about and, talked down to, there's a real sense that you ask why would Californians want to leave? Well, so that's the message we're getting. The message we're getting from the rest of the country is, why don't you just go away? We don't want you. Get out of here. It's like, well, okay, we'll take you up on it. It's like,
I mean, it is interesting. My folks live in Arizona, and there's a lot of folks coming in from California moving to Arizona. I mean, there's folks from everywhere moving to Arizona right now, right? Major influx. So it's interesting. There is a lot of negative animus towards Californians. At the same time, they're like, we're happy they're moving here. So it is, I agree. There is, there already are these sort of regional animosities. I mean, for sure, right. The frustration in New York City with, the busing and, transporting of folks from, south of the Texas border through the agencies of Texas, right? I mean, it creates a lot of animosity. And likewise, Texans are really annoyed that they have to, as it were, deal with this national problem that they think is not being dealt with in the right way nationally. So I think that the regionalized conflicts are already there around real substantive policy issues, the disagreements where we have to have, as it were, just to go back to the idea of politics, we have to have rules that we share and we disagree about what those rules should be. And we're not processing those disagreements democratically right now, or less and less so.
I want to talk about some of the what do you think are some of the most important potential obstacles to this, or what are some of the biggest hurdles or things that we would have to go through? I know in the book you talk about the trade-off between short-term costs and risks and instabilities and longer-term benefits. So what do you see as those trade-offs? What do you see as those kind of obstacles? At least
I mean, there is a kind of weighing I try to do of various kinds of the what ifs. What do we do about this, or what do we do about that, and what do we do about this? And I try and at least put a number of those issues on the table and try and think about them. I don't try and solve them. I just say these are the kinds of things that good negotiators would have to solve. I mean, some of the most difficult ones, I think, are with respect to national security and the movement of troops and military installations. I don't think that's such a big thing, but certainly who has what kinds of nuclear weapons would be very, very significant question. I think that there's a pretty obvious object lesson from the dissolution of the Soviet Union that former parts of the Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons and gave them up, aka Ukraine, are seeing that that's not a good way to go. So I think that that's a very significant and difficult part of negotiating. I'm not so worried about sort of straightforward material resources. People are pretty good at bargaining over their material resources, but for sure, it would be costly, it would be painful, and it would take time. I mean, there's no doubt in the short term that dissolution is not an easy thing to do, but it's not insurmountable, and it's been done around the world many times peacefully, right? So it's not an impossible set of tasks. There are a lot of different moving parts to think about, but for sure the questions about national security and new national borders and talking about what those new nations' borders would be would also be a very heavy lift. The longer term benefits is that we get to maintain representative democracy.
Right. And
that's for me, that's the
right.
one main value that I'm optimizing on. However, there are other values involved, like justice and welfare and common defense and security, all of the nice values that are sort of very clearly laid out in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. And I think on balance, over a longer term, we would do better on almost all of those. Maybe not on common defense. And here, the international relations folks are going to know better than I. But, maybe there is a real worry about losing one of the world's hegemons. On the other hand, you might also think that maybe that's a good thing to lose one of the. I don't know how to adjudicate that dispute, but that's at least a significant objection. But that's not so much a cost. I think the costs are going to be, straightforward, the same kind of opportunity costs that you have with any kind of a legal dissolution of a long-running set of relationships between peoples or entities. It's always costly, but oftentimes in the long run, it makes sense to do that dissolution.
Yes, and I think some of the reticence that people have is they're focusing on the opportunity costs of your proposal, but they're not really thinking about the opportunity costs of just staying the direction we're going. This is something you say that you can't just measure what you think is going to happen under this scenario. You have to compare it to, what's the road that we're looking at currently. And if we're already headed towards a place where there's already increasing political violence, there's already a loss of democratic norms, there's already all these problems, you have to weigh the two against each other.
I thank you, because I do think that's really, really important. You don't get to like compare a super rosy picture of what we could be
right.
to the worst picture of what would happen with dissolution, right? You got to take a realistic picture of both of them. And at least on my picture of our current, what I call the status quo trajectory, our current path, we're losing democracy. Oh boy.
That's fine.
No, it's supposed to go the other way.
Oh, yay, no democracy.
We're losing democracy.
There you go.
We're losing basic governability.
Right.
Our death rate in the COVID pandemic was much worse than our comparative countries. That's a governability crisis. We did great in terms of technology. We did quite well in terms of counter-cyclical steering and maintaining people's welfare, material welfare, but we did really poorly in terms of death per population. We just let a lot of people die. And that's a governability crisis. And then we're on the way, I think, to real worries about increasing stochastic political violence, right? So that we're not doing politics anymore, we're doing political violence or politically motivated violence. And that's not the road we want to be on, but that is the road we're on. So, my suboptimal solution has to be compared to the suboptimal road we're on. Thank you.
Yeah. I do want to run down a list of just a real quick kind of hit you with you can get like a minute or two response, because there's always, if you just stop a person on the street, there's going to be a list of like 4 or 5 things they're just immediately going to come out of their.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, there's one thing I wanted to ask you. How does this proposal change, or how would your proposal change if we really start going, if the status quo really starts going down a really bad direction? So I'll just lay out a scenario which I think is maybe not likely, but I don't see it as implausible. I think it's possible Donald Trump wins the election on a baseline legitimate level. So without, cheating or overturning the result, he actually wins. And I think any election where he wins the presidency, he's probably going to take the Senate and the House with him. So now he has the full federal government behind him. I think he's mentally unwell. I don't think he's, I think he has some serious psychological flaws, and I think he's, don't need to get into it. I think his cognitive state is not in good shape either. So he's very unstable, dangerous person to be in office. And then he has all this institutional, I'm sure you're familiar with Project 2025 and this whole right-wing, project that they're really gearing up to do some really dangerous things that I don't think a lot of people are really, kind of aware of the scale. And I think they mean it. I think they really, are thinking about these things. So here's one possible scenario I can see. Let's say that, he wins, legitimately. There's going to be protests the day after the election, or the day after it's announced that he's won. Especially in California, there'll be mass protests, which is fine until January 20th. But then the day he takes office, he says, these people are, treasonous. We got to put these protests down. And he really clamps down, maybe sends in troops or the military. I wouldn't put it past him to, start shooting protesters or things like that, where you really have kind of a Tiananmen Square kind of situation gets really bad. And so it becomes more obvious that, okay, this idea of sitting down and having like this negotiation, or we're going to democratically work through how it gets split up, that if the main governing institutions are not in that democratic state of mind, how does that change where we go from there? Seems like a much different situation.
Again, I'm not a very good prognosticator.
I'm not asking you if you think that's going to happen. I'm saying,
no, I understand. So what does that look like vis-a-vis my proposal? It seems to me it's at least quite an opportunity for what I call a non-legal or a official or a non-procedural way of getting to dissolution, right? Because it surely would present an opportunity for state-based political entrepreneurs to press very hard for separating themselves from the national government. And then, of course, you're going to, not of course, it seems like one way that scenario might go is that then there's a tricky part about how much control of the military the presidency would have. And, if there's one institution, I think, at least in the American system, that is really firmly entrenched in its commitment to constitutional principles, it is the U.S. military. I just don't see, if in fact, let's say California and Oregon and Nevada, or California and Oregon and Washington say, we want to secede and we'd like to negotiate about that. I just don't see that civil war scenario where all of a sudden troops are going to be in the streets. It doesn't make really any sense. And it seems really implausible. If in fact, more authoritarian moves are made at the national level, playing dictator for a day or a week or a month or 5 months or whatever it's going to be, and, suspending parts of the Constitution, there's lots of American institutions which won't take that sitting down. I don't know exactly what that scenario looks like, but it's not going to look like we all sat down and negotiated the dissolution. But there is a way in which, negotiations can still happen well short of military conflict, right? I'm not saying that there wouldn't be more stochastic political violence, kind of quasi-terroristic individual actors, small groups, juntas, that kind of thing. But we've already got some of that. We saw that, January 6th, 2021. So we've already had the political violence, and we're probably going to be dealing with that one way or another. So I think it would be, weirdly, it might be an opportunity to accelerate a process of national dissolution. In part because I really doubt that, some horrible scenario is going to happen where, the U.S. Army is going to march on Sacramento. I just really don't even see that that's plausible.
Well, yeah, I think there would be a split in the military, but I hope you're right. Let's say that, because obviously it'd be not a good situation. But I'm not quite as sure. But
let me just throw in, because just to put your scenario in a slogan, right? The president of Turkey, Erdogan, when he was mayor of Istanbul, had this really amazing sentence. And he said, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it to your destination and then you get off. And that's, of course, the way democracies die now. They don't die with tanks in the streets. They die with people who come to power through democratic means and then undercut the democratic means of getting them out of power. And that's the worry. If things look very authoritarian in January 2025, February 2025, I have some faith that a lot of people will not just kind of watch it go by.
Well, I know they won't hear. I cannot see a situation where, say, there's a national abortion ban, or they really follow through on this deportation program they have. Those are things that affect everybody here. We have like 2 or 3 generations of immigration into California. Everyone's an immigrant, almost like everyone knows somebody who could get caught up in that, whether they're a coworker or a colleague or a student or this is not like, some abstract thing about, there's some people somewhere that are, it's like, no, these are people that everybody knows. So I just don't see that the Californians are just going to sit back and say, okay, you're going to come in and start, going to people's doorstep and rounding people up, and we're just going to not say anything.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. I mean, another plausible thing is that it takes longer for the dissolution process to go forward with a kind of, nullificationist subfederalism happening for a while. I mean, we've had that in American history before. That's basically post-Reconstruction. You had a nullificationist area of the country that said, yeah, we're not going with that whole 14th Amendment thing. Yeah, we're not doing the 15th Amendment. No, thank you very much. And we'd like to reinstitute the slavery under another term. So they sort of did the nullificationist, confederalist move. And that's a possibility for a while, but it's unstable. Whether that gets us then to dissolution or it gets us to some kind of new settlement, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to run through real quick, and you can shoot these down. Some of them are easy, and I know some of your answers are going to be because I've seen you interviewed. So number one, you can't do this. It's against the law. It's unconstitutional. Yeah, it's not against the law. There's nothing in the Constitution that bars either secession or dissolution. There is one Supreme Court case, Texas v. White, which says that unilateral secession, that is when one person, one party, one state or one group just says we're no longer part of it and doesn't get permission from the other part, is illegal. But there's nothing in international law that's against negotiated dissolution, and there's nothing in American law that's against negotiated dissolution. Despite what Justice Scalia may have said in a letter to somebody. Well, yeah, I mean that was also, he didn't know about Texas v. White clearly when he wrote that letter. Just the fact that the idea that somebody's actually quoting a private letter as a reference for something. There are no clear geographic boundaries as in the Civil War era, so it doesn't make any sense to try and establish new borders the way that you're discussing. Well, we do have sort of more or less decently regionalized areas. There's going to be conflicts over some of them. I mean, just in California, for instance, there might be a conflict between inland and coastal California. I don't think it's that significant. There are actual secessionist conflicts and irredentist moves from eastern Washington trying to join Idaho. So, you might have some renegotiation of the state borders, but there are sort of our state borders are working pretty well, and those are at least a baseline for starting on negotiation. So, borders are never clear, but they're part of what constitute a nation state is the territorial sovereignty that they express. And of course, we have discontinuous borders already, and we have an internally riven nation already. So, Hawaii and Alaska with discontinuous borders. And of course, we have 570 some sovereign nations within the United States, that is Native American sovereign territories. Yeah, I think people discount the fact that just by being in a certain region, even if you have really stark political differences, you share a common interest in the sense that you have the same disagreements. Like I have a disagreement with a conservative or somebody more on the right in California. We have a need to engage more than I do with a conservative on the East Coast, simply because there's more things to disagree about. And the rules more directly, the rules you're disagreeing about really do affect both of you. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, that argues in favor of a kind of regionalism, simply because the decisions that have to be made are affected by the geography. All right. You talked a little bit about national defense and like nuclear things. Is there a threat of a dissolution giving a rise to China and other powers that could pose a threat to global order? That's something that I hear quite a bit. It depends on how well you think we're doing vis-a-vis China. Right? Does the fact that we're the particular nation we are increase our bargaining power, or does it decrease it in certain kinds of ways? I'm not a good enough IR scholar to be able to say, but what I know from reading international relations literature is, there's a sort of set of tendencies that get your worldview. If your worldview is a big stick worldview, then yeah, dissolving the United States means you decrease the size of the stick. If you're a negotiator over shared interests worldview, then, California has pretty significant economic ties with California that are quite different than, for instance, Minnesota's or Louisiana's, right? I mean, those are just very different situations. We might actually do better containing the authoritarian reach of China with several different nation states adopting different policies. But again, the limits of my knowledge and ability to say definitively this is the way it is. I think it's, there are some downsides, obviously, and there are some upsides, right? Just if you're just talking nuclear deterrence, right? Is it better to have one enemy who's a nuclear deterrent or five? Say if we split up into 5 nations, I don't know about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as China, I mean, one of the real sticking points for independence for California is we are constantly fighting with the federal government over trade, and they just, it's a big issue because we have so many ports and there's so much trade that goes on here. We kind of touched on this just a second. One of the speakers, and I think it was the one where there was Lawrence Lessig and some other ones, he really raised this idea of, he was really concerned about the ugly politics that you're drawing on, increasing the violence. I think you kind of addressed that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, let me just say what I understand from the literature on violence, which is sort of taken the big data approach to when you get civil violence. And you get civil violence in general only there are sort of 2 strongly correlated variables. One is the move from a stable political system to an unstable political system. That is the move from democracy to something like that political scientists call anocracy or electoral authoritarianism. When you get that move, you get increases for an increase for political violence. So I think that with my idea of splitting up the nation, it would, as it were, dissipate some of that, because you would get more stable representative democracies, more stable republics on the other side of the process. And one of the other things that's strongly correlated with increases in political violence is a sense that the political system is hopeless, that the political system is broken, that you can't possibly get through. And that in particular, when you have various groups that feel like they can't ever get their interests heard in the political process. And you usually get this through some kind of factionalization. So whether it's religious factionalization or ethnic factionalization, racial factionalization, or linguistic factionalization, if there's like a small population of language speakers that are different than the dominant language, and those people always get screwed, then you get increases in political violence. And that happens in particular when previously high status groups lose their status. So I think those 2 conditions, backsliding from democracy and increased factionalization, where people feel like their identity is what's preventing them from getting any uptake in politics, those 2 conditions would be reduced by my solution, not increased. On the way there, for sure, ugly, hateful politics, but politics is quite different than violence. And people only resort to violence when they don't feel like any ways in which politics works for them. If we're on the road to dissolution, those 2 pressure points to getting increased violence will decrease because people will see that things are changing, right? It's scary, but things would be changing.
Yeah, the analogy I think you use is of a pressure valve. Like we're actually trying to relieve pressure that's being built up in the system. And one last one. This was also something from that same speech that you gave. Somebody raised the idea that the dissolution does not really address the capture of government by capital interests and big business. Now, I know how you answered that previously, but if you want to kind of just reiterate it here.
I mean, the problem of sort of regulatory capture by large interests is endemic to all forms of government. It is a kind of constant battle. The worse your representative institutions are, the more easily they are to capture. So when you can capture sort of, let me just go back to the judicial mode of capturing, right? If you can get your really unpopular regulatory interests, and you have sort of two choices for getting them passed. One, you can try and get them through a national legislature, or you can get them through a judiciary, and you can get them sort of pretty reliably through a judiciary. You're going to go for the judiciary, right? Because they solidify the things, and they're unaccountable for, their quasi-regulatory decisions. So I think the problem of capture is actually a problem of institutional design. Not entirely, right? I mean, capitalism is capitalism. It's going to do its thing. And it might be certainly always trying to, various kinds of large interests are always going to be trying to use whatever political instruments they have. The point of sort of fussy bureaucratic messing around with institutions is to try and get them more impermeable to that kind of capture. And the more open your political processes are to representative democracy, the more likely it is over the long term that you're going to get a less captured government. It's easier to capture a fully authoritarian government or an electoral authoritarian government than not. I mean, corruption and electoral authoritarianism are as old as really the post-World War II settlement.
Well, I think this is. I'll put it back up here.
Thank you.
Put it. I think this is a really good read, and I'm still kind of mulling over the idea. I read it a few weeks ago, but I'm still mulling over the ideas. Of course, admittedly, I came to it somewhat sympathetically, right, based on my background. But I think it does have a lot that people can think about. Especially like you talk about your main concern is an increase in responsive government. And that's something I think that just speaking as like where, the activists that I know in California, one of the things that we will dwell on a lot is that we don't have a responsive government just in California, like our state government and state policies, because of the federal structure, right? So when you have this two-party red and blue, like, Democrat, Republican, that whole two-party system filters all the way down. And basically California is a one-party state.
Yep.
The Republican Party is, I think it's 50-50 on any given election, whether they beat out, independent or, no affiliation. So that's not good for democracy itself. Even if I'm on the left or I'm on the Democratic side, I can easily think of, if we were to have reconstitute democracy in California, if it was a multi-party democracy, I could easily come up with 5 or 6 different. I could see that there would be an establishment Democratic Party. There would be like a Bernie Sanders kind of wing. There would be a moderate conservative, say, George W. Bush conservative. There'd be like a libertarian. There might be a green. There could be, and that would force them to get into coalitions, and you would get out this. You wouldn't have to have this lesser of two evils and incumbency, political machinery that's just in the state. So I really agree with that. It's just not just ratcheting down the violence and the downward spiral that we're in, but there's real opportunities. I mean, we should look at it as what kind of positive things could we be looking forward to into the future. Is there any other kind of closing points or closing messages you want to say to people as we close out here in the last few minutes?
I mean, I think the thing I would say is really just very straightforward. I've put this book forward and the sort of ideas as a kind of democratic conversation opener. I think that we owe it to ourselves to think a little bit more broadly about other ways that we could do things and how we might be able to get there. I think we can have better political systems. We have the historical memory, we have the sort of human capital, we have the amazing resources. We have the ability to do constitutional democracy a lot better than we're doing it now, but we do have to think a little bit outside of the box. And so I'm offering this kind of book, not as a blueprint for how to do things, but for a conversation opener, as a set of conversations we have to have. I mean, just the kind of thing you were just talking about. How does the nationalization of two-party conflict infiltrate state legislatures and even cities and counties, right? How do even those get sort of captured by stuff that's happening at the national level that's not really relevant to the political thing? And also like how our regional differences might be something that instead of trying to force things through one sort of national one national aperture, maybe we should be attending to the ways in which we could improve politics by localizing it or regionalizing it some. So I just want to leave that idea that this is a democratic conversation opener. I'm not saying this is what we have to do, but I do think we have to think really seriously about the road we're on. I'm very worried that the road we're on is a road of increasing political violence, a road of less and less national governability, and a road we're on the way to losing representative democracy itself. And so we have to think about ways to get out of that. I guess that's where I'd leave it there.
Oh, thank you. So I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. I thought it was really interesting, and I would encourage everybody to go out and look at the book. It's available many different places. It's funny. I have to get books because I cannot read on a tablet or. I'm just old fashioned that way.
I like to write in my books, so that's where I can figure out what's going on. So I'm old fashioned too. But
thanks again for stopping by, and
thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate your time and putting me on your show.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, take care.